Sally Rutledge. Today we're here to talk about dsm-5 recognition of moral injury as it relates to accountability within current systems. I think other important things to note are the treatment framework that's being built around this, and keeping in mind that the ultimate goal is to improve individual outcomes, which I think often gets lost in mental and behavioral health. This week, I would say that there are a decent number of people talking about this, and I would say that there are a decent number of people who have been doing this for a really long time, so it's funny to me that the DSM people think that they own moral injury. But anyway, again, going back to my most important concern, which is how does this impact individual outcomes? So as I'm looking through and trying to understand moral injury, my original framework was in terms of viewing moral injury from an abuse perspective. The argument for adding moral injury to the dsm-5, naming moral injury, according to the people involved in this change, allows a person's experience to be seen, understood, and taken seriously. I wonder if the dsm-5 is needed to see, understand, and take people seriously. I would argue a manual is not needed for that. I think just simple humanness. All right. So, what is moral injury? As described by AI, because that's how we understand everything. Moral injury describes the emotional, cognitive, and spiritual distress caused by violating one's own moral code or witnessing harmful acts, and it can contribute to mental health conditions like PTSD, depression, and anxiety. I would argue that moral injury is the PTSD, depression, and anxiety. It's hard to categorically separate those things in my mind. While moral injury was added to the religious or spiritual problem category, Z code, in the DSM-5, making it a recognized focus of clinical attention, it is not a distinct mental disorder. I don't know how you disorder someone for the fact that they lived through some terrible shit. Okay, now, moral injury trauma definition. Moral injury refers to a mental health problem arising from a violation of deeply held ethical beliefs, often through perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that transgress one's own sense of right and wrong. As a distinction from trauma, moral injury is rooted in ethical or moral violations rather than physical danger. I don't understand why we evaluate suffering only on a physical basis. Like, I would rather you break my fucking arm and rip it off my body and beat me with it than emotional and psychological abuse. But, you know, it's just my own perspective from having endured a variety of suffering, physical, emotional, psychological. The symptoms of moral injury can involve guilt, shame, self-condemnation, loss of trust, and a disrupted sense of meaning in the world. I think that that's really one of the most critical features of moral injury, is this disrupted, I don't know that I would say sense of meaning in the world, but sense of self as I pertain to my understanding of meaning in the world. let's check and see. Pause there, let that absorb a little bit. Check and see if anybody's involved. Still just me. I love being alone. All right. One of the things when I was looking through, and I'm going to add this to the stream, one of the things I found when I was looking through just researching moral injury a little bit was a really interesting moral injury playbook done by the Air Force, I guess, and Space Force. That seems very Michael Scott, but yeah, I thought this was really interesting. I think the spiritual aspect of this is something to consider, especially in today's society. Moral injury is not new. It is not the result of anything humans have done throughout time. I think as this really good moral injury playbook states pretty early on, moral injury, it says it right here, the author said moral injury is as old as war itself. And I would argue that moral injury is as old as creation itself, because with creation comes destruction. I mean, it's a necessary part of creation. As soon as there's human witness to destruction, there's moral injury. So I think that's interesting to consider. Each person's framework on this idea of moral injury is based on their own experience of moral injury, whether through their own lived experience or witnessing someone else's lived experience. And so for the Air Force, moral injury is as old as war itself, because that's what it does, is war. I think this is cool too. So Brett Litz is quoted in here saying, moral injury is the psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. Again, there's this like spiritual connection with moral injury. I think in our country, spirituality has been inadequately reduced to religion, and I just don't. I think that is a limited view of spirituality. For me, I grew up in a pretty rigorously orthodox religion. I'm not that religion now. I don't practice any religion. Spirituality has definitely changed. To back up a little bit more, I live with suicide. I had kind of experienced suicide on a temporary, fleeting basis for a moment after pretty intense hip surgery. I had my bilaterally had my hip joints reoriented, which involves surgically breaking your pelvis and then screwing it all back together to address hip dysplasia. When I had that done the second time, a disc herniated in my back, and I had a back surgery 6 weeks after my hip surgery. So L4-5 laminectomy, discectomy with a broken pelvis is pretty tough to do. And there was a moment a couple of days after my back surgery, I was laying on my couch and had to get up to go to the bathroom, and the only people there with me were my kids, and I couldn't move. Like, my brain was telling my body that I had to get up and go to the bathroom, and my body was not reacting. Like, functional paralysis. And it scared me. I don't even know how long it lasted. And I remember thinking to myself, this is not a way that I'm willing to live. Like, I'm not going to stay in a life and try to function for myself or other people when it's something I can possibly endure. I got this Never Stop tattoo on my arm after that. Not the font I picked. Kind of a funny joke amongst the family now. Oftentimes when my kids want me to stop, they'll go like this. Or at least they used to before all jokes stopped. It's like a universal symbol for stop, as if somebody just like... Anyway, May 22nd of 2022, I experienced suicide that didn't go away, that wasn't fleeting, and I've lived with it ever since. My understanding of moral pain is from like my foundational understanding of human beings and the world changed in an instant because of something that happened that I witnessed and was a part of. So for me, spirituality changed then. Spirituality for me is like a combination of, well, it's, I would say, guided by a sense of higher power. My higher power is what I would be proud for my kids to know that I chose in different situations, and also similarly, what I would be proud of my kids for choosing in a variety of situations. And then also math, because a lot of the abuse that I endured throughout my life was gaslighting abuse. I also grew up pretty religious. That's great, and with sexual trauma, so my ability to dissociate is skilled, and I think religion is a dissociative skill. Any temporary suspension of disbelief is a dissociative skill. So as we go through, I want to go back to this Air Force, Space Force moral injury playbook. I think moral injury does have spiritual dimensions because of how profound the impact is on like a fundamental individually held beliefs of each human being that are completely destroyed in the lived experience of a moral injury. Yeah, and then the authors here go into a few different aspects of moral injury. They talk about this idea of 3 levels of moral injury. One model consists of these 3 levels, which is moral pain, moral distress, and acute moral injury. They talk about moral pain as a lived experience, like the lived experience that doesn't align with a person's understanding of life. So, for example, a soldier, in combat that's ordered to do something that results in an outcome they could have prevented with different choices, and now they have to live with this. I would say what's the right word? I don't even know. A position of being torn. So moral pain is the acute, as described by this, moral pain is the acute lived experience. Moral distress is unresolved moral pain. So if you live through this experience and don't resolve it, moral pain will then progress into moral distress. And then unresolved moral distress becomes acute moral injury, which is chronic moral distress, which I think has also been called CPTSD. So we're just like relabeling stuff. I thought an important note here was the connection between moral injury and sexual trauma and institutional betrayal. They talk about that in terms of the military. Potentially morally injurious events rarely fall into simplistic categories. They note that if someone suffers harm from a leader, they may also feel anger toward themselves for supporting or continuing to participate in the system instead of speaking out. I think that's really interesting, especially from like an abuse perspective. They mentioned sexual abuse. I think an important distinction between this study of the military and, thinking of instances of abuse as the moral pain or moral injury from leadership really brings a more comprehensive view to abuse in general. Imagine if the leader is a parent or in years lived older family member, a friend, a spouse, a child, these sort of foundational people in our lives being the perpetrators of the moral pain or moral injury is shown to have more intense impact. I think that that's definitely true. I don't think that much study needs to be done to know that the people that are your leaders are people that you trust, and when trust is betrayed on top of living through something horrendous, that's going to do significantly more damage. They then go on to talk about protective factors. I think this is really interesting too. This moral injury playbook, they talk about this at some point in the text, but this is not new. Clergy and religious leaders have been dealing with moral injury by other names for thousands of years. I mean, it's sort of like the idea behind creation. Human beings have been dealing with this for thousands of years. We live in capitalism, so we've monetized support and called it care. And it's not really that good. Honestly, care is bad and dangerous and typically does harm. So it's interesting to me to see the dsm-5 clinical people that are doing objective harm in the care that they're practicing, ignoring the fact that this kind of support and this kind of suffering is as old as human beings itself. And instead of paying attention to what's working, we're going to reinvent all of it with this one dsm-5 Z code. Like, it's makes me want to break shit. Okay, so let's talk about healing from moral injury, because I think that that's really where clinical medicine is lacking, is the implementation of how do we use this to improve individual outcomes, which means promote healing, helping the person who's suffering feel better. All right, so healing. They talk about preventing and mitigating moral injury. A lot of this has to do with like the framework of war. Yeah, and so I'm at a point where I can a flash of a moment of a memory will hit me, and I can pause it and leave it there for as long as I want. It does harm to leave it there, but I can pause it. It's not like I'm like living in it. At first it was tough to do, but like part of having PTSD is a disciplined practice of surviving it, and for me that means managing what's happening as it's happening. One thing that I have maybe I have very little control over what flashes through my mind. I have very little control of what goes on around me. I have very little control over my nervous system's reaction to what goes on around me. I have a disciplined practice of managing my nervous system as it's activated, and it's exhausting. It's not something that I love doing. I mean, for me, nervous system activation is one of the biggest motivations for ending my life. I just don't want to. I mean, it's terrible to live like this. Let's see. What do we have next on moral injury? Oh, I thought this was really interesting. They talk about the high-risk communities. Of course, people in higher leadership because there's more accountability. I thought this was really interesting too. Remotely piloted aircraft and intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance operations as high-risk communities. Since September 11th, the Department of Defense uses remotely piloted aircraft at an exponentially increased rate. They talk about the different things, the symptoms that they see with RPAs, challenges with physical health, sleep hygiene, relationships, and religious participation. I mean, that is the definition of moral injury. They call it shift work sleep disorder. I mean, I think that we're just like renaming things like PTSD, PTSD, moral injury, like abuse, like, yeah. People can't talk about it because it's classified. I think really important that I noticed a big consistency with PTSD in terms of this remotely piloted aircraft is there isn't a primal urge for survival. There is no physical threat that can be used to rationalize the choices made. Yeah, many in the RPA community have become so good at outwardly coping and managing stress that their inward struggle is well hidden, increasing the risk for moral injury, and the longer such feelings remain unaddressed and unresolved. Yeah. I mean, same for someone that's experiencing abuse. Like, it's not something that can socially be discussed. There's a risk to it. And going back to physical, emotional, psychological, I mean, unlike traditional combat, an RPA operator is in no physical danger. Unlike someone in physical abuse, someone that's being emotionally and psychologically abused is in no physical danger. It is unlikely that an RPA operator will experience the same fear-based response that typically characterizes PTSD. For many in traditional combat roles, the primal urge for survival and self-defense justifies their actions. Same for non-physical abuse. Their response does not justify the non-physical actions. I think there's a book by Peter Levine called Waking the Tiger, and it talks about PTSD, chronic PTSD. It examines, people that were in the exact same traumatic situation, some that got over it and some that didn't, and there's a physical release component to traumatic events that helps resolve trauma, process trauma, move past trauma, and sitting behind a desk or, not receiving physical abuse can really exacerbate suffering without that physical component. Like medicine, like law, it's hard to quantify without a physical component. And that's not just limited to the people trying to make decisions around it, it's to the people experiencing it too. Yeah, and then healthcare workers and first responders. I think that this is really important too. One of the frameworks that I saw pretty quickly on LinkedIn was from a healthcare worker perspective. So social workers, nurses. I think if you're on the front lines and you're experiencing this kind of just like graphic horror, there's no, I mean, obviously that's experiencing moral injury. Yeah, I thought there was a lot in here that was really helpful. That's pretty much all that I wanted to talk about immediately. And then I want to kind of do a... Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like the idea of moral injury. My original framework was from an abuse perspective. There's a lot of people that I spend time with during the day who are stuck in abusive housing with, for example, like parents. The things that a lot of people have to endure from leaders, loved ones, is really tough. You know, if you're living with suicide and because of abuse, I cannot get out of this. Like, I don't have anywhere else to go. I have no money. I have no food. I have no place to stay. I have nowhere else to go. I need a bed to sleep in at night. I'm stuck in my parents' house. And then that parent tells you things like they wish that you were successful in killing yourself. I mean, that's gonna fuck pretty hard with my fundamental understanding of the world, my life, love, parenting, family structure, everything. And I don't really know that the goal should be resolution for that, you know? Like, there is no resolving some moral injuries. Resolution would be gaslighting. Healing from moral injury, I think, is a matter of radical acceptance of the injury, which is tough to do. All right, so now let's go move on a little bit more to who is at risk for moral injury. We just did a pretty deep dive into military. We did a dive into people that are living in abuse. We talked a little bit about social workers, nurses. Another something else that I read consistently is fundraisers often are vulnerable to moral injury, and I believe that that perspective is from you know, we're trying to provide support for people who are suffering. We can't do it. We need to witness the unhelped suffering because we cannot raise the funds needed to help people. Like, yeah, I mean, like, money, guns, whatever it is that prevents suffering, if you have access to it and can't use it, it's going to feel pretty bad to see people get hurt or die from a lack of intervention. There's a couple really interesting things I read online about moral injury that I want to share. This is from Perry Radford. He's a fundraising coach and consultant in New Mexico. He said, moral injury is understood to be the strong cognitive and emotional response that can occur following events that violate a person's moral or ethical code. Purpose-driven people like social workers, nurses, and fundraisers can be easily susceptible to experiencing moral injury because their identity is deeply connected to their work performance. I think that's interesting too. One of the things that was mentioned in that Air Force playbook was a lot of times the reasons for enlisting can help mitigate the impact of moral injury. If you go into the service with really deeply held values around joining up, that tends to keep people a little bit more sturdy against the negative impact of moral injury. I think the same can be said for nursing, for social work, for fundraising. Where that gets a little bit tricky and slippery to me is when we start talking about abuse from a moral injury perspective, especially if it's within a family system, because there is no choice. No one gets to opt into their family. And so removing what could potentially ease moral suffering, which is reasons for being there, when that's taken away, the moral suffering, the moral injury is felt significantly more acutely, and I would say does objectively more harm. When you don't get to opt into a situation that's causing you moral injury, it's going to necessarily do more harm because there is no consent on any level, including initial involvement. Another really interesting quote was from Dr. Heather Sekaria. I hope I'm saying that right. She's a consultant psychologist in London. She does PTSD trauma workshops. She said that naming moral injury matters because it allows a person's experience to be seen, understood, and taken seriously. She said that's where the real work begins. I don't believe it requires DSM language to see, understand, and take someone's experience seriously. I think where the real work begins in the mental and behavioral healthcare industry is an industry-wide shift from requiring clinical framework to operate back to basic humanness. If a clinician can't see, understand, or take someone's experience seriously without a handbook, they might need to be in a profession that allows them less control in the product that they're producing. I think it's a little bit risky to have individuals that are free to make decisions that directly impact a person that's in need if they need to read it out of a textbook. I think that's where AI has a huge opportunity to replace human beings and reduce risk, reduce harm, focus more on harm reduction, and then also give people a little more agency. Hearing directly from one person, I think, is pretty dangerous in terms of distributing liability. Relying on one person is risky. When it comes to mental and behavioral health, one person's opinion just doesn't fucking matter. I don't care. And clinicians are often the deity in these relationships. Healing doesn't have a power dynamic, so I have a little bit of a problem with this whole idea of dsm-5 adopting moral injury so clinicians can somehow better be puppeted into providing some kind of care. Like, I just don't get it. What I do like about this DSM language is most pathology assigns blame with the pathology. For example, dissociative identity disorder. I grew up in gaslighting abuse. I was married in gaslighting abuse. I mean, like, I spent 45 years in pretty significant gaslighting. Dissociation is a tool that helped me survive. I would get the clinical label of dissociative identity disorder, which is, like, serious. Like, that leads to schizoaffective disorders. That leads to other pathology. I think I've been given, like, everything on this side. BPD, depression, anxiety, PTSD, CPTSD, I don't even know what. If I said all my symptoms and limitations, the list would keep on going. I just learned to shut my mouth so I didn't get any more. All of those diagnoses, the blame is on me. Not at one time did I get the clinical language of, damn, like you lived in abuse your whole life. That would place the blame on somebody else. No. Instead, every pathology that I got, the blame is on me. Sorry, my body's doing what it's supposed to do. Sorry, I'm great at checking out safely when something really bad is happening to me in real life. Humans are limited by their understanding, and this kind of shit isn't in textbooks because it would reduce the need for clinicians to heal. Dr. Nikki Jameson from Australia said having moral problem added to the DSM-5 code helps with understanding, research, potential future funding, and treatments where needed. Again, I really have a problem with clinicians having to own language so they can understand, research, fund, and treat. I don't like to use clinical language, but there is a pathology for framing everything from your own understanding, and it starts with an N. Dr. Nikki Jameson is an author, researcher, academic, suicidologist, and social worker with lived experience of moral injury and suicide prevention, and the founder of Moral Injury Australia. Okay. Jenny Prohaska, PhD, high performance psychologist from Kansas, says moral injury is a silly thing to even distract ourselves with. Ranks now with discord with neighbors and living alone. I can't believe this even made a blip on the radar. I'm more concerned about that and what kind of delusional self-importance we are distracting ourselves with as professionals in this career. Thank you, Jenny. Dr. Jenny. Dr. Prohaska, thanks for saying it. Andy Cullen. He is involved with Serving Beyond the Uniform, trauma recovery leader, Westpac Social Change Fellow, veteran co-founder at PTSD Resurrected INC, and a mental health advocate in Australia. A lot of Australians talking about moral injury. Andy Cullen says, ensuring people have access to treatment modalities for moral injury that sit outside the medicated route, which for many is often presented as the only option. Naming moral injury matters, but even more so does creating pathways for healing that honor the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, without reducing their suffering to the label. My hope is that this recognition will open doors to better treatment options for sufferers, rather than be exploited by the medical industry for profit or relegated to a tick and flick on claims form. Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of this DSM-5 code language has more to do with billing than anything else, and I think mental and behavioral health care has for so long ignored statistics that now statistics don't matter and we're just like making shit up. I think the phrase that's used is evidence-based. Where's the evidence? The studies that I see in mental and behavioral health, I think like industry standards. Evidence studies require 5 people minimum. They don't really follow people for a very long amount of time. So it's tough to draw conclusions. And the people that they follow are from skewed samples, usually people that are already in care. That's not really representative of the population of people suffering. And so to simply add language and lean on that as the pathway for treatment options is not realistic. What other language in the DSM-5 has led to treatment options? Like, I live with PTSD and there's not a single clinician that even understands the experience of that. Nor are they willing to talk about it beyond flashbacks, sleeplessness, nervousness. Like, no. That's not really my experience of it. It's like big, broad, academic intellectual ideas. That doesn't help me live it. Yeah. It's my full notes. I think this is a really interesting conversation. I was gonna go till 11:30, but ain't nobody here, and I really want to do a little feedback on a video that I watched recently from a suicide expert that had some pretty offensive things in it. So I think I'm gonna stop this stream. Yay, moral injury. In conclusion, I think the biggest advantage to adding moral injury to the dsm-5 is it doesn't pathologize the person. It describes their experience. I think that's really missing in the mental and behavioral health fields. I think pathology is weaponized. I think it creates, it further adds to an unhealthy power dynamic in mental and behavioral health care. So I think this idea of moral injury is a great talking point. I could burn the entire DSM-5 and not care. So I guess I'm looking at it from the positives. In that, at least it's clinical without stigma and shame. It sort of honors the experience of the person suffering, and that doesn't often happen in care. Anyway, I'm excited to see what happens with this and where it goes and how treatment is developed around it. I think anyone that's in contact with someone that is living through moral injury, this moral injury playbook from the U.S. Air Force is a really comprehensive place to start. It gives a lot of foundational work that can then quickly be advanced to something that can really have an impact on individual outcomes. And I think this idea of healing community and empathy is potentially going to go a long way to improve individual outcomes.